So I'm very, very happy to welcome Sir John Polkinghorne to the podium. This is his second visit to Eastern Nazarene College. We hope that will be followed by one or two more before he goes on to learn firsthand as an experimentalist about the eschaton. Sir John.
Thank you, Carl, very much. I'd like to say I very much enjoyed being here. I've only briefly been part of the conference. Well, I've also been very deeply impressed that 20 or so hard-pressed, busy academics have been prepared to take 3 weeks of their free time, that's a significant slice of free time, to work and talk together on the subjects of open theology or open theism. There must be something in it, I think, if they're prepared to do that. And I want to talk a little bit about what I think are the promises that open theism offers to searchers after truth and after religious truth. Now, theism is under pretty heavy attack these days from some of my colleagues in the scientific world. Richard Dawkins back home in England, and you have your corresponding figures over here in North America. And the burden of their rather intemperate remarks very often is that religion is simply fantasy. It is fairy tales, really. And that belief in God is about as irrational and ill-founded as belief in the tooth fairy. And Alistair McGrath, who was actually at seminary with me, in his robust little book called The Dawkins Delusion, which is a response to Dawkins' The God Delusion, points out that very few people are converted in adult life to believe in the tooth fairy, but significant numbers of people are converted to believe in God in their adult lives. So there can't be quite an exact correspondence between the two. In fact, I think there's no correspondence between the two. And we have to make a response to that. And the response that we have to make is to insist that the question of truth and the unblinking encounter with reality is essential to religious exploration as it is to scientific exploration. The question of truth is central to religion. Religion can do all sorts of things for you. It can comfort and strengthen and inspire you in life and indeed in the approach of death. But it can't really do any of those things unless it is actually true. So that the question of truth is absolutely essential. And religious people are people who should be, and in many cases are, prepared to be clear-eyed in their encounter with reality. In fact, I think some of the clearest-eyed people I know are actually religious, in the technical sense of being monks or nuns, living a religious life in that sort of way. They may be living a somewhat confined life in the cloister, but they're certainly very open-eyed in relation to what is going on in the world, in the encounter with reality. And that is, I think, the essential promise of open theology. It is prepared to look at the world, to see what the world is like, and to take the world on its own terms in that sense. And when we do that, of course, we see a very strange and mixed sort of picture of the world in which we live. On the one hand, there is much which is beautiful and fruitful in the scientific story about what is going on in the world, about the structure of the world in which we live, and about the cosmic history of the world in which we live. I worked in theoretical physics, and a word that's absolutely essential in the conversation of theoretical physicists, though it absolutely never appears in the formal papers that they write for journals like the Physical Review, an absolutely essential word in the experience of physicists is wonder. It's doing research in physics, like most worthwhile activities, has its pretty fair share of routine, has its pretty fair share of frustration, as the good ideas in the morning prove less persuasive in the cold light of the afternoon. It's hard work, and what the reward that we get for it are the occasional and deep experiences of wonder at the rationally beautiful and rationally transparent structure of the world that is revealed to our inquiry. So we live in a world that is wonderful in its structure and has been astonishingly fruitful in its history. And we're thinking a little about that this morning. We're thinking that the universe, as we observe it and experience it, started in the singular event of the Big Bang some 13.7 billion years ago, And it started extremely simple. The very early universe is almost uniform, expanding ball of energy, about the simplest physical system you could think of. That world that started so simple has now become very rich and complex, with you and me, actually, the most complicated consequences of its evolving history, at least that are known to us. Henry Rawson is a friend of mine, who writes books about science origin. One of his books says, when an astronomer looks through a telescope at a distant galaxy, he or she should remember that the most complex system in the whole universe that we know about is 6 inches this side of the eyepiece, inside the skull of the astronomer. The human brain has 10 to the 11th neurons, about the same number of stars there are in the Milky Way, and about 10 to the 14 connections between them. It's a fantastically complex system. So the world that started as a ball of energy is now the home of saints and sciences. That's an astonishingly fruitful history. And raise the question that maybe there's something happening in the course of that history. That's one side of the story, but there was another side of the story. The world is not only rich and beautiful and fruitful, but it's also messy. It is full, for example, of blind alleys. The biological history of life is full of extinctions and catastrophes of one sort or another. We live in a world that is not only fruitful, but is also full of suffering, and there is a connection between the two. So the picture we have of the world is a strangely ambiguous picture. We live our human experience. We have, I think, quite deep human intuitions of hope. A book I'm very fond of is Peter Berger's little book, A Rumour of Angels, which some people know, which takes everyday events and says, stop a minute, think about them. Don't take them on the surface, think about what's going on in them, and suggest that when you do that, you'll sometimes find very deep signals of transcendence, as he calls it. One of his stories is a child wakes up in the middle of the night, the parent goes to comfort the child, the parent says to the child, it's all right. Berger says, what's going on there? Is that a loving lie on the part of the parent? We live in a world that has cancer and concentration camps in it. It is not manifestly all right in a straightforward sense. But nevertheless, it is an assurance that the parent needs to give to the child as part of that child's growing up into full humanity. I don't think it is a loving lie. So we have intimations of hope that we know we live in a world which is subject to transience and decay, a world of inevitable death. So if we look open-eyed at the universe, we see this curious combination. We see a problem of evil in the world, and we see a problem of good in the world. And where do they both come from, and how are they reconciled with each other? And I think in particular, the questions of theology, the problems of wrestling with the strangeness of suffering present in the world is absolutely central to the issue of credible religious belief. I think that we all know what the problem is. If God is almighty and loving, whence comes disease and disaster? He said cure us a long time ago. And I think that that's the problem. The problem of the theology problem is the one that holds more people back from religious belief than anything else, and troubles those of us who are religious believers probably more than anything else. And so we see a world which has a cosmic history which is not consistent with being interpreted as the unfolding of a perfect plan, complete in every detail. But equally, it is not consistent with the world just being a concatenation of random events, one damn thing after another, as one might say. We live in a world that seems to have science of meaning and science of frustration and meaningless. And what are we to make of that? And one of the open theology suggests to us that we should think of the world neither as a perfect unfolding of an already eternally written history, nor as a meaningless world, but as something much more like an unfolding improvisation, in which the creator and creatures interact in an unfolding process in which each have their parts to play and each have their independence to play. And taking science seriously can help us, I think, to adopt that position and follow it through. And science helps us in that way through that insight of science, which some people think is actually the point of conflict between science and religion, and it is, of course, science's insight. The process of the world is an evolutionary process. It is a process that involves an interplay between chance and necessity. Slippery words, and we have to be sure we know what they mean. Chance doesn't just mean capricious acts of the goddess Fortuna, chance in this context simply means happenstance. This happens rather than that. The range of possibilities that might happen in the world vastly exceeds what there has been time actually to occur, even in 13.7 billion years of cosmic history. So there's a contingency in the world, and that's what chance means. But equally, of course, there is a degree of regularity in the world as well. The world is not just a swirling, turbulent chaos, and it is the interplay between chance and necessity, between contingency and regularity, between happenstance and reliability, that actually produces the fruitful presence of the world. Scientists like to say that novelty emerges in those regimes which are characterized as being at the edge of chaos. As to say, regimes where both order and disorder, chance and necessity, if you like, interlace with each other. If you are too far on the regular side of that divide, things are too rigid for anything really new to happen. You can get rearrangements of what's going on in the world. You can rearrange bits of Lego in the world, so to speak, but you can't create new bits of Lego in that really. It's just too rigid. Equally, of course, if you're too far on the haphazard side of things, then nothing new that comes into existence will persist. It will fade away as soon as it comes into being. And it is that very delicate, creative balance between chance and necessity at the edge of chaos that produces the fruitful presence of the world. And that means that there is this interplay, and that means that there will be a world that is fruitful, a world that theologically we can interpret as a world in which creatures are given by the God of love the gift of freedom to be themselves and to make themselves. Now, you know there's a historically ignorant caricature of what happened when Charles Darwin's great book, The Origin of Species, was published in 1859. The caricature picture, which you find still propagated in the media and so on, is that when Darwin's book was published, all the scientific people shouted, yes, 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 and all the religious people, including, of course, particularly the obscurantist clergy, shouted, no, no, no. And that was the final part of the way to big science and religion. That's not at all what happened. There were doubts and difficulties on both sides, in both communities. A lot of scientists find it very difficult to accept Darwin's ideas. In particular, where did these small variations, which are so important to the theory of the natural selection, where did they come from? Darwin, of course, didn't know the answer. Ironically, the answer had, I can't remember the date and the timing, is that either just about then, or just before then, or just after then, been discovered by an unknown monk in the Austro-Hungarian Empire called Gregor Mendel, who was able to discern the experiments of plant breeding, the elements of genetics. That was then, it wasn't until that was rediscovered at the beginning of the 20th century that Darwinism became a picture of evolution through natural selection, became scientifically widely persuaded and rightly accepted in the scientific world. So there were doubts on the scientific side. So Sir Richard Owen, who was the greatest comparative anatomist of the day, never accepted Darwin's ideas. Partly from scientific doubts, and partly, I think, from professional jealousy. But that's and on the reader side, there were people who, from the start, welcomed Darwin's insights, as telling us something about how the Creator had chose to structure and bring about the unfolding history of creation. In North America, Asa Gray was a key figure in that respect. Back home, Charles Kingsley, Anglican clergyman, also was a novelist, coined the phrase that perfectly expresses the theological way to think about an evolving world. He said, no doubt God could have snapped the divine fingers and brought into being a ready-made world, but God had chosen to do something cleverer than that, bringing into being a creation in which creatures can make themselves. The process of evolution is the shuffling exploration of happenstance, bringing to birth the fruitful potentiality in which the laws of nature have been ordained. That's a very positive view of evolution. It's a view, I think, that's very consistent with our Christian belief that God is a God of love, because the creation of the God of love will surely not be simply a divine puppet theatre, which God pulls every string. It will have some appropriate gift of freedom given to creatures to be themselves and to make themselves. And I think that my view would be that an evolving world of that nature is a greater good than a ready-made world would be. It is a greater good, but it has a necessary cost. It is taking place at the edge of chaos. That means that the waters of chaos are always lapping around, and there will therefore be blind alleys and malfunctions as part of that exploration of potentiality. And that gives us some help, I think, thinking about the presence of natural evil in the world, disease and disaster in the world. And science helps us in that respect by pointing out how these things happen. You see, we all tend to think that if we'd been in charge of creation, we would have done it better. We would have kept all the nice things, the sunsets, the flowers, and that sort of thing, and we'd have got rid of all the nasty things, the disease and disaster. But science, more science tells us about how the world works, what the presence of the world is like, the more we see that those things are inextricably intertwined with each other. You can't pull them apart and keep this lot and throw away that lot. There is an inescapable shadow side to the fruitfulness of creation. That is part of the open, unfolding presence of the world. You can see that in a whole number of different illustrations. Let me just give you a couple of them. The engine that has driven the fruitful process of biological evolution here on Earth, turning a world that for 2 billion years or so was simply a world of bacteria, is the world that we see today. The engine that has driven that process is, of course, genetic mutation. And it is the mutation of germ cells that produce new forms of life. But if germ cells are going to be able to mutate, produce new forms of life, and the world is not a magic world, the world is not magic, it's not a capricious magician. If the world is not a magic world, then it is inevitable that somatic cells, body cells, will also be able to mutate. And when that happens, sometimes that will produce malignancy. You can't have one without the other. And so the fact that there is, of course, the fact that there is cancer in the world is obviously an anguishing aspect of the world, which we can rightly feel disturbed and indeed angry at times. But it is not something that a God who was a little bit more competent or a little less callous could easily have removed. It is the necessary cost of a world in which creatures are free to make themselves and new forms of life to develop in that sort of way. In other words, it's not something gratuitous. And just to take another example, of a slightly different kind. Of course, we have tectonic plates on the Earth's surface, and sometimes when those plates slip, they produce severe earthquakes. They slip out of the sea, they produce tsunamis. So you might say, well, wouldn't it have been a good idea if God had arranged creation in such a way that the Earth had a completely solid crust, there were no plates to slip? But the answer is no, it wouldn't. Because though the slipping of tectonic plates produces earthquakes in that way, it also allows mineral materials to well up from the interior of the Earth and replenish the surface of the Earth. So they again, you see, you have this interweaving of things that are fruitful and things that are destructive. And as I say, I don't think for a minute that removes all the difficulties or complexities that we feel about the occurrence of disease and disaster and natural evil in the world. But I think it is a small but genuine offer that science has to make to theology, and it is of course very congenial to an open theology that sees the world as an unfolding process in which these processes have to be enabled by the flexible educational structure of the world in which we live. It seems to me that there is a great promise in open theology. It seems to me that it takes these things seriously. It is something that we can defend and commend in our society. And in doing that, we can show that we are not unaware of the strangeness of the world. We're not unaware of either of the world's richness or the world's bitterness, which are both aspects of the way things are. And we are able to take that absolutely seriously and hold that in creative interaction, I think, with our understanding of God's action in the world, of God's will for the world. It seems to me that that picture of an unfolding world, a process in which God engages with, is one that is very consistent, for example, with the way that the Bible portrays God's relationship to creatures and to creation. I don't know a bit about this morning, the Bible portrays, in the Hebrew Scriptures, portrays God in continual interaction with the unfolding history of God's people, Israel. It portrays that, of course, in sometimes, frankly, anthropomorphic terms. I mean, I was thinking this morning that Hebrew Scriptures are bold enough to speak several times, in fact, of God changing God's mind. So God says to Hezekiah, "You're going to die." And the guy says, "No, I don't want to die." God says, "Okay, you can have 15 more years of life." I mean, obviously that's a little bit of an anthropomorphism, to say the least of it. But at least the God of the Hebrew Scriptures is not a God who is outside of history, just looking down on it all. Is not engaged with the unfolding history of Israel. Very much the contrary, it seems to me. And of course, in the New Testament, we see God's engagement with history being demonstrated in a unique and profoundly significant form in the incarnation, the birth of God's Son taking human life, the birth under Augustus and the death under Tiberius. You could hardly have a greater engagement with history that is portrayed in the unique episode of the incarnation. And that's, I think that is where I find the deepest, the most profound and moving Christian answer to the problems of theology. Because the Christian God is not a God who is a benevolent spectator above the suffering of the world, the travail of creation, looking down, however compassionately, on the strange history of creation. But God has been a fellow participant in that history, a fellow sufferer who understands in Whitehead's celebrated phrase. And in the cross of Christ, we see, I think, God stretching in the incarnate Son, stretching out the divine arms to embrace, share in the suffering of the world. And that seems to me an extraordinary, profound, and uniquely Christian response to the problem of suffering, and is very much part of making theistic belief indeed possible for me. It's a very important part. And also, of course, open theology can take perfectly seriously our intuitions of hope. The world may be much more like an improvisation. World history may be much more like an improvisation than a performance of a fixed score. But we have every reason to believe and trust that God will resolve the great fury of creation by achieving God's purposes, even if they are attained through contingent paths. And I think that the creation will find its fulfillment ultimately, of course, through the whole of creation sharing in the resurrection that has been manifested already in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And open theology seems to me, frankly, incredible, because it is resolutely realistic. It really is no fanciful fairy story, no sort of consoling, unrealistic theme, sentimental theme. It faces the strangeness of the world, but it also faces the faithfulness of God. It sees a world in which there is undoubtedly death, and death is real, and death is a real separation, but it is not an ultimate reality. The last word lies not with death, but with God. So I think open theology is a theology for our time, and indeed for all times. I think it is a theology of great promise. I think it is certainly the theology to which I commit myself.